afternoon session. Welcome to it. We're looking forward to a very interesting panel now. We have speakers who are all speaking in one form or another about culture and survival of culture, survival through culture, survival of culture. And I think you'll find that they're all, even though they're separate papers on very different topics, I think you'll find they're all very interesting on the theme of survival. So we have, speaking for us this afternoon, we have, oh, I didn't introduce myself, I'm sorry. I'm Erica Beecher-Monis. I teach at the law school. You know, people forget that law school is also part of the humanities, but we are indeed. So I think it's very important to remember all the different branches of humanities that come together here as part of our culture of humanities. And we have today speaking with us, we're going to have Rahul Mitra, did I say that right? Rahul Mitra, who's an assistant professor of communication in the and he's going to talk about communicative complexities of integrated arts management. And we're going to give him, each speaker will have 20 minutes to speak, and we'll have 5 minutes for questions after each speaker. We have also today with us Adam Verima, who is going to be giving the paper of someone else. He's going to be giving the paper of Cherokee, who was not able to be with us today, but her paper is entitled Born in Haiti, No Grave Can Hold Him, Voodoo's Survival in Marvel's Zombie Comics of the 1970s. And because she's not here, we won't have questions after that paper. But then our final paper will be Felicia Lucht, who's the assistant professor at CMLC, and her paper will be The Survival of Older Immigrant Languages in Detroit, the Case of German. All right, so we will welcome our first speaker, who is Rahul Mitra.
All right, thank you so much for being here. Okay, that's going to be a little bit of trouble. So you probably won't be able to tell the top of my slides, but trust me, it's there. Again, thank you so much for the Humanities Center for funding this work, as well as the College of Fine Performing and Communication Arts at Wayne State University. A fantastic side benefit of this project is it helps me travel to a fantastic destination that I've never been to in the past. I got to visit Alaska a couple of times this past year or so, and hopefully as this project nears towards completion, I'll be able to head up there a couple more times as well. I'm going to be talking about some of the communicative complexities of integrated Arctic management, which is the title of a 2013 White House policy for managing resources, especially energy resources, in the U.S. Arctic. This data collection process is still continuing, and I'm going to be focusing on two main issues, really talking about enactments of career and subsistence work among Native communities in Alaska and the U.S. Arctic, and the enactment of policy and practice, just basically giving you a little teaser for both. So our agenda for today, I'm going to be starting off talking about why the Arctic is such a compelling story to consider when you think about the complex natural landscape, the social scape, as well as the really intricate policy scapes that the people living in the Arctic have to deal with on an everyday basis. I'm going to then move on to talk about my perspective of communication as constitutive of social reality. I am an organizational communication scholar, which means I really focus on how organizations communicate internally as well as externally to different stakeholders as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about the research methods which I'm employing for this project. And then I'm going to be talking about two manuscripts which are really coming up right now from this ongoing project. The first manuscript is in press, actually, and it focuses on culture-centered careers and really looking at subsistence careers of native and indigenous folk up in Alaska. And the second manuscript is still in progress. I'm in the middle of analyzing the data while it's still collecting more. And this really looks at how resource management policy is negotiated and implemented. And then, of course, discussion and questions. So, to begin, and to lay out a little bit about why the U.S. Arctic is such a compelling story. For me, this is a great example of the fragile ecosystems out there. Increasingly, the Arctic, for instance, has witnessed, I think it's twice or three times, really the effect of global warming as the rest of the world has. And its effects are manifest in a number of different ways in everyday life, ranging from really disappearing summer sea ice to thawing of the permafrost, which is the frozen soil, which is leading to coastal erosion, which is really dangerous because you've got a lot of native villages on the coast, and so there's a lot of concern that whole villages basically might simply fall off the face of the earth, and a number of villages are actually talking about rehabilitation and applying for funding. But on top of that, you've got impact of flora and fauna, whether it's in terms of migration of caribou herds or availability of hunting polar bears or whales. And this is really essential for a subsistence career, since it's a subsistence way of life for native communities. So from the environmental aspect, this is definitely a compelling story because you've got all of these interesting changes going on. By the way, the map belies the actual size of Alaska. Alaska is 1/5 the size of the main continental United States. The first time I saw that superimposed on the map of the continent, I was a little taken aback myself. The economic story, or the resource extraction story, is also complex when you think about what's really going on. It's almost a case of contradictions. On the one hand, the U.S. Arctic has a ton of natural resources. Of course, oil and gas that we hear a lot about, but also resources like fisheries. And for example, the bulk of our salmon farming in the U.S. basically comes from up in Alaska, and it's also the #1 salmon fishery in the world, or #2 at least at any rate. Minerals as well. But at the same time, despite having this plethora of natural resources, there are a number of factors which make actually extracting these resources and using it for social welfare really problematic. Of course, you've got the harsh extreme climate, the topography, the lack of infrastructure historically, which means that despite the huge size, there's very little roads and for transport. Pretty much everyone has to fly on chartered planes to get from one settlement to another in Alaska. So the last time I was up there was in October, and we had like crazy gas prices over here. We were at like $3.50 or $3.60 at that point over here. I was in Nome, Alaska at that point, and I took a picture of one of the gas pumps, which showed the gas prices to be like $9.50 per gallon, which was ridiculous. But telecom and basic communication issues, again, lack of infrastructure. The cable infrastructure simply hasn't been laid down. And historically, both federal and state agencies have argued that it's been too expensive and not economically viable to lay down that infrastructure. Food production is ridiculously expensive as well. A lot of the food has to be flown into Anchorage, which is Alaska's largest city of 350,000 people, which makes standard of living, cost of living really prohibitive in the state. In addition to that, another paradox or contradiction, if you want to call it that, is the fact that you've got these communities which are very clearly at risk but they're also prosperous, or they have the potential to be prosperous at any rate. I talked about native villages, for instance, that are in danger of coastal erosion and the lack of severe shock to their traditional subsistence way of life. But in addition to that, if you think about even the larger cities like Anchorage or Fairbanks, you realize that there's a real lack of economic diversity. 1/3 of the state's finances comes from the oil and gas sector. The other 1/3 comes from the federal government. And everything else, literally everything else, is the remaining 1/3. So which means that oil and gas remains such a flashpoint across the red-blue divide. It almost becomes almost unthinkable for most Alaskan citizens to picture an economic or social sustainability situation without factoring in oil and gas. At the same time, these communities are also highly prosperous. Alaska has something called the Permanent Reserve Fund, which basically means that a chunk of all the oil and gas revenues goes to each Alaskan citizen. It's almost like a tax return for everyone without having to file taxes. And that has a plus point, obviously, but the negative point also is that a lot of people have argued that it's made a lot of, especially far-flung settlements, way too dependent on this state dole. There's not much incentive for entrepreneurial expansion per se. The other interesting thing to realize is that while there's a large Native Alaskan population in the state, these folks are far more prosperous, actually, thanks to the establishment of organizations like the Native Alaskan Corporations in 1971, compared to, say, Native American groups elsewhere in the mainland. So again, the dichotomy of being at risk and yet being prosperous is very much present. A final complexity that we really should keep in mind is the fact that geopolitical interests have really come to the fore, especially with ongoing tensions with Russia and the U.S. actually poised to become chair of the Arctic Council, which is an international group of 8 countries which have strategic interests in the Arctic. So integrated Arctic management, and I have those scare quotes there for a reason, because although that's the name of the policy, if you really look at the policy scape in the U.S. Arctic, you'll realize that there's way too many agencies that are vying with each other, and not only are they sometimes potentially redundant, but they're almost at conflict with each other as well. So IAM was really put forward by the Interagency Working Group appointed by the White House in 2013, and it had 3 main pillars. Number 1, a focus on a whole-of-government approach, really trying to cut down on all this flotsam and jetsam of different agencies with their own agendas. Number 2, really focusing on meaningful conversations, not only within the agencies, but with external stakeholders and community members as well. And then number 3, a focus on science-based decision-making, keeping in mind that Native communities had their traditional indigenous knowledge as well. So trying to create some sort of meaningful conversation between modern science and traditional knowledge systems as well. Each of these 3 pillars really focuses a lot on communication. What makes this policy, however, really interesting and still tensional is that we have ongoing conflicts between all of these different stakeholders. State, federal agencies, Native communities, as well as multinational corporations. And in fact, since the architect of the IAM policy was transferred last year, this entire policy itself is pretty much in limbo right now. No one quite knows whether the White House is going to pursue it or not. The state of Alaska has created its own plan for resource management, and so no one's quite sure on the ground whether or how these policies really intersect or not. So again, the tensions almost continue. Where does communication come in over here? Communication has been posited by several scholars as being a practical discipline, which means that it focuses on everyday practice and everyday interaction. So I would argue that it's well poised to really examine how policy, codified policy and everyday practice both form and inform each other as well. In particular, I ascribe to the school that argues that communication constitutes organization and social reality, either through those everyday interactions or those social networks, those relationships that are formed, the various discourses and texts, and so on and so forth. So keeping this basic theoretical framework in mind, I'm going to talk about two broad aspects. Number one, how work and careers are socially constructed in the Alaskan context. And number two, as I said, how these policy structures and actions are actually implemented. This project utilizes qualitative research methods, and I was lucky enough that I was invited to be a visiting fellow by this group called the Institute of the North, which is a policymaking nonprofit based in Anchorage, Alaska. And so they were sort of my entry point to meet up with and talk with and interact with the representatives of many of these broad organizations working on the ground. Till date, I've collected about 20 in-depth interviews with representatives from a whole number of different organizations. Generally, these have lasted about 30 to 60 minutes, and got about 235 pages of single-spaced text thus far. In the years still left, I've got 10 or 15 more planned, especially more from the Native communities and civic leaders rather than formal organizations. In addition to that, I also collected brochures, pamphlets, white papers, annual reports, what have you, from these different organizations and their partners and stakeholders, which it's a huge pile. Finally, in October, I traveled with a number of these organizations for a week-long policy deliberation tour in 3 of the smaller regional hubs in Alaska. And this was important because we were moving away from the financial and the organizational capital of the state, which was Anchorage, to really look at how Native communities basically considered all of these basic and crucial issues going on. So I have about audio recordings for about 20 hours or so, as well as video and photographs as well. So the first manuscript, which is actually in press right now at Human Relations, which is an interdisciplinary journal of organization studies, really looks at how career is a cultural practice, and which is enacted through everyday communication acts. In particular, I look at the issue of subsistence as an ongoing way of life for the Inupiaq people, not as something which is which is an archaic custom, or even as something which can be directly reduced to a question of food security or food insecurity, as many of the policy officials, the state and the federal policy officials, would want to do on this tour that we were a part of. Instead, we found that the community leaders were very vehement, really, about challenging these mainstream definitions of what constituted career success. Being a subsistence hunter for them did not mean basically not being a part of the modern economy. It was very much a mark of success of being an Inupiaq person. They also downplayed a lot of traditional mainstream requirements of career success, like, say, college education, for instance, and said, well, of course, a college education is important, but you also can downplay traditional customs and knowledges and practices. Subsistence was noted to be important for shaping self-actualization, not just for the individual, but also for the community at large. So in a way, it really resisted top-down environmental policy. So there was this one incident, for instance, where there was this suddenly impromptu, heated argument about the federal government's decision to ban or to bring in quotas on polar bear hunting, which did not take into account the Inupiaq people's sentiments and knowledges about how the sea ice had shifted polar bear mating season issues as well. Yeah, that was interesting, an hour-long debate about that. Also important to note for this project was how these career roles were really hybridized. So the same person was often in the role simultaneously of being a member of the tribe and being a person of the family whose husband or son was a subsistence hunter, and at the same time maybe she was the mayor of the settlement, or maybe she was the research and development director of the Native Alaskan corporation that she worked at. And these career roles really intersected very nicely. Finally, there was this ongoing sense-making of what subsistence really was. So it wasn't this monolithic conception of, oh, again, this traditional way of life. There is this understanding that even tradition has to evolve and change. It is all about continuity and change as a dialectic. So even if you do go hunting for polar bears or whaling, for instance, what kind of boats do you require? Why is gasoline important then? And in that kind of a situation, yes, the $10 gas price is a huge impediment to being a subsistence hunter. The second manuscript, which I'm right now in the middle of coding the data, really uses something called structurating activity theory, which looks at how everyday policy structures are basically implemented through individual interaction sequences, or what Heather Canary calls activity systems. And the idea is that these local activity systems do in fact intersect, and over time, as contradictions emerge, either due to a new development or due perhaps to a paradox or confusion in the knowledge structures, that generates changes. So the contradictions really become really important in generating change. And these contradictions, therefore, then permeate not only to the local system level, but also in the broader structural level as well. And it's this ongoing, again, action across the local and the macro level. So right now I'm in the middle of analyzing that data, and thank you so much. That's my email, and if you would like to get in touch with me or ask me questions right now, that would be fantastic. Thank you.